if you can do a deal with these media companies, great. We won't force you into arbitration. If you're Facebook or Google, you would say, we're the ones driving all these readers and potential subscribers and viewers to, news sites, video sites, that kind of thing.
Making Google and Facebook pay. Last year, Australia passed the News Media Bargaining Code, forcing Google and Facebook to actually pay content creators. They've had a duopoly on digital ads for years, but they've never had to pay for content. Australia News Media got over $150 million in 1 year because of the law. Canada and UK are already working on their own versions. The question is, will this happen in the US? Stay tuned. So, Bill, what did you learn over this trip to Australia, and how do you see this affecting what legislators do in the U.S.?
I had the great good fortune to spend a few months earlier this year in Australia, thanks to the Judith Nielsen Institute for Journalism, which sponsored me there.
That's
and
nice.
I spent much of that time looking into something called, as you said, the News Media Bargaining Code, which was passed a little over a year ago as a way of trying to force Facebook and Google to pay some kinds of funds to news organizations, large and small. And they came up with a really interesting way of doing it. Rather than saying we're going to impose a tax on Facebook and Google, or we're going to force you to pay company X this much and company Y that much, what they said was, you have to do deals with these news media companies. And if you don't, then we could eventually force you to do what's called baseball arbitration, which is where each side makes an offer and the arbitrator gets to pick one or the other. So, and that's what they use in baseball. And it's a way of making sure that both sides submit a pretty honest offer. So that really kind of put Facebook and Google into the crosshairs. And even as the legislation was being passed, and certainly afterwards, they started doing a bunch of deals with companies as big as the Rupert Murdoch News Corp to very small daily newspapers or a coalition of daily and weekly newspapers.
So basically, because that way of negotiating is good because because both parties want a deal.
Facebook and Google did want to have to submit to arbitration, and the nature of this code was, if you can do a deal with these media companies, great. We won't force you into arbitration. If you don't do a deal, then you could be forced into. So that was a way of compelling Facebook and Google to do deals. And you might ask, why should Facebook and Google be paying any money at all to these news organizations? And if you're Facebook or Google, that's very much the question you would ask. Because if you're Facebook or Google, you would say, we're the ones driving all these readers and potential subscribers and viewers to news sites, video sites, that kind of thing. Why should we be paying anything? If anything, we're the ones giving news media value. What the news organizations were able to convince the Australian government of was, if you do a Google search right now for, say, Putin, the first thing you're going to see is a bunch of headlines from news organizations. And if you click on that more news link, you're going to not just see headlines, but snippets of news. So all these news companies did deals with Facebook and Google. Some of them weren't able to do deals, especially with Facebook, because Facebook got very cranky about it about halfway through and basically said, we're not going to do any deals anymore. But I talked to a lot of news organizations, small and large, and most, not all, but most of them were quite happy with this deal in Australia. So Canada now has a bill that's very similar to Australia's, and it stands a good chance of passing sometime this summer or fall. As you said, the UK is considering something similar. And most importantly, in terms of media market size, the United States Congress is making noises about a similar type of deal, although one that would cut out really big news organizations, anybody that employs more than 1,500 people.
Okay, yeah, because they don't necessarily need it or
I mean, well, if you look at the three big newspapers / news sites. The New York Times is doing great these days. They have 10 million subscribers. The Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. Last I checked, his checks aren't bouncing anywhere. Wall Street Journal is owned by Rupert Murdoch. So what we're looking at is more, can you support local news organizations, startups, that kind of thing.
Got you. And so you think, well, first of all, the New York Times gets about 20 million, it's estimated, from Facebook right now. Wall Street Journal gets about 10 million. Right. So they have the big ones have these kind of back office sort of deals a lot of times with the platforms. The Wall Street Journal actually just reported that Facebook's thinking about rethinking all of these deals and dropping them. Do you think that means that they're more likely to do a deal, or the legislation, or that means preempting the legislation, or this is just the new normal that Facebook and Google do not want to, Facebook doesn't want to pay out to new big news publishers?
I think it's important to distinguish Facebook and Google when it comes to news. Pretty much every step Facebook has shown over the last few years has been, we want to get out of the news business. Yes, they've done some deals with some news organizations. They have some charitable donations they made to various initiatives to help support news, but they really want to wash their hands of it overall. I mean, that's their kind of underlying strategy. That's certainly the impression I got from talking to people in Australia and their dealings with them. Google, on the other hand, sees Google has much more ambitious programs to support journalism. You can say they're just a cynical way of trying to avoid regulation, or you can say it's an honest to goodness way of supporting journalism. More importantly, they're a lot more dependent on news because when people search on Google, sometimes they're searching for a pair of sneakers and they don't care about Ukraine. But a lot of times people do go to Google to learn what's going on with COVID, what's going on with the flood in Yellowstone, what's going on with the drought in Africa, that kind of thing. For Google, it's important for them to be able to surface credible news, because if all their surface is a bunch of crap, people aren't going to go to Google as much. That's
so interesting. And so from what you learned, because if in Australia they are already paying out, it's estimated $150 million to news organizations in Australia, I mean, in the US it would be like a much bigger number. Is that something that could actually happen? Do you think there's lawmakers behind that in the US that would want that to happen? That's
a really good question. If you just extrapolated that $150 million to the US market, it'd be a couple $2 billion a year. Now, for Facebook and Google, it's not a huge amount of money, but if they start doing that all over the world, now we're talking a significant amount of money. Just enough of the fact they don't want to be doing individual deals with every little website and newspaper and TV station. It's very time consuming and it's kind of exhausting. The US is quite different from Australia. Australia has a very heavily concentrated media market, not just Murdoch, but two other companies called 9 and 7. The US obviously has some really big players, but you don't have the level of concentration. You also have in the US Congress, especially if we end up with a GOP-controlled House and maybe Senate, which seems increasingly likely every day that gas is over $5 a gallon, where Congress people's concern about Facebook and Google tends to be more around their allegations that their viewpoints are being censored or taken off, that Biden wasn't available during the election. They don't care quite that much about, I have a local paper in Ohio and it's about to go under. It doesn't seem to be that big on the radar of most Republican Congress people.
Please like and subscribe so the YouTube algorithm will show our videos to more people. Also join our Substack newsletter for exclusive updates, or if you're on the go, find us wherever you listen to your audio podcasts. Click on one of the links to find our next video, and also check out the links below for more information. Thanks so much for watching.